Super excited you guys are here today. It's the noon service, and it's one of my favorite services because we get to have people from the pulpit group share. And today, Jill Becker is going to share. Also, she's from Celebrate Recovery. She's here somewhere. I don't know where she's at. There she is. Come on down, everybody. Welcome Jill Becker up here for Celebrate Recovery. She's going to come up. And while she's coming up, a couple things is you should have got a handout when you came in. That is the news to know sheet. There's a bunch of stuff coming up. Check that out, and so you know what's going on. And other than that, we had a great time a couple of weeks ago. Mike Lindell went to Celebrate Recovery and spoke. He gave everybody there a pillow. So if you weren't there, too bad. But he's going to come back, so just heads up. And then I got to share last night, or 2 nights ago in Celebrate Recovery, and it was just awesome. And we're really excited about what God's doing there and what He's going to do.
Good morning, everyone. So I've been in recovery for a couple of years now, and this morning I'm going to share my story, my recovery journey with you. And what's unique about my journey is that it does not involve addiction. My hurts, habits, and hang-ups were different. I used other things like control and perfectionism to cover up my pain versus drugs or alcohol. So I really want to impress on everybody that Celebrate Recovery is not just for people with addiction. It's for all different types of hurts, habits, and hang-ups. And so part of our process at Celebrate Recovery on Friday nights is 1 week we'll have a teaching, and the next week we do a testimony. And some of those testimonies are live, and other times we use DVD testimonies from other Celebrate Recoveries around the country. But it's really the testimony part of it is what it's all based around, in that it's always stories about how God works through our lives to bring about amazing transformation and healing. And so I am going to read you my testimony this morning. That is the MO, how we do it at Celebrate Recovery. They require they be written, so here it goes. My name is Jill, and I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with abandonment issues and toxic shame, which is really just another way of saying that I've never felt good enough for anything or anyone. My drugs of choice to cope with my issues were control and perfectionism. I grew up in what would be considered a fairly average middle-class home. My parents actually did love each other, and they stayed married until my dad passed away when I was in my early 20s. I had one brother who was about 1.5 years younger than I was, and who I always believed was the favorite. He was. We had a nice home, and we had all the necessities in life, if not a lot of fancy extras. My dad traveled a lot for his work when my brother and I were young. And when he was home, he was very attentive and loving, but he definitely did not wear the pants in our family. This was apparent to me from a very early age. With my dad on the road, my mother was left to function as our primary caregiver, and she was ill-equipped to handle 2 rambunctious toddlers. I don't remember a lot from those early years, but watching my mother interact with my own kids in their young years later gave me a window into what my own young life was like. As I observed my mother during that time, it became evident to me that she wasn't what you would call a natural nurturer. I tell you these things not to make you think poorly of my mother, who I really do believe did the best that she could with the resources she had, but to demonstrate that this is where I think a lot of my issues with abandonment originated. Although I couldn't have articulated it at the time, I think that I felt very insecure and not loved or accepted for who I was by the person that mattered most, my mother. Although I wasn't physically abandoned, I had emotional needs for safety and security that were not met. And of course, at the time, I believed my experience to be normal because I had nothing else to compare it to. I therefore internalized those feelings of not being worthy the way I was, and I unwittingly carried those destructive feelings into every situation and relationship for the next 40+ years. When I was 7 years old, I became very ill with a chronic autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis. I literally spent months in the hospital during that time and was told that I nearly died. There are a lot of things that can cause or trigger an autoimmune disorder such as this, but looking back now, I firmly believe that my illness was a physical manifestation of the immense unexpressed emotional turmoil that I was feeling inside. That belief was reinforced over the years when I would have subsequent flare-ups of my colitis that were tied to times of internal stress and anxiety. In order to deal with my unworthiness, insecurity, and anxiety that I felt as a child, I began to develop defense mechanisms to protect myself. One thing I realized fairly early on was that if I performed well, for example, if I got good grades, I would get some positive affirmation from my mother, and this would make me feel better inside. This defense mechanism followed me into adulthood as I realized that positive affirmation from anyone could make me feel better about myself. This led me to a life spent performing for everyone all the time, trying to do things the right way so that people would like and accept me, and then I would feel worthy and lovable. This performance-based mentality that I had developed led me to a life of perfectionism and control. I was obsessed with doing things perfectly and controlling situations and people to ensure that things were done right. Because if they weren't, my whole identity was at stake. My worth was completely tied up in how I performed and if people accepted me. The problem with this approach is that if you live for people's acceptance, you will die from their rejection. And I did die from people's rejection many times over the years. I discovered another coping mechanism for my feelings of unworthiness in my early college years. I had not dated much in high school. I wasn't very popular or good looking, but I sort of came into my own my freshman year in college, and I began to realize how I could use my physical appearance to attract positive attention from men. This again made me feel worthy and lovable. And although I didn't take this attention to an intimate level, I realize now I became very dependent on it to feel okay about myself. I would take a lot of care for my appearance when I would go out to a party or the bar to ensure the optimal amount of attention would be directed my way. And it really wasn't until I was 47 years old and starting to experience the changes that come with age that I was able to admit to myself how important my physical appearance was to me and my sense of worth. And the problem with basing your worthiness on your physical appearance is no one stays young and attractive forever. So I was fully enmeshed in my defense mechanism-driven life when I married my first husband at age 24. He was a good friend from high school that became more during my junior year in college. We got married because I got pregnant shortly after I had graduated from UND with my nursing degree. Our marriage was highly dysfunctional, and our individual baggage filled our home and dictated our life. I spent my time controlling him and trying to fix him, and he spent his time getting into trouble and looking for me to bail him out. I hear Celebrate Recovery has a word for this kind of relationship. Codependent. This marriage ended after only 18 months with our son less than a year old. The dissolution of my first marriage marked the first time I went to see a counselor. It was then that I discovered that my relationship with my mother was complex and something other than what I thought it was, and that I might have some issues stemming from my early childhood. Unfortunately, identifying that those issues existed and working through them and healing from them were two totally different things. That would come many years and many heartaches later. I was remarried to my current husband of 20 years, Todd. God is a God of miracles. By the time I was 28. To say that the first several years of our relationship was rough would be like describing an atomic bomb going off as a firecracker. My childhood abandonment issues were out in full force, and I was often in survival mode, trying to protect myself from the fear that I might not be lovable enough to make him stay with me. We spent years on what I call the crazy cycle, with me trying to make him a certain textbook or romance novel kind of husband, and him just trying to hold on to who he was and love me the best he could. I realize now that for many years of our relationship, I was wanting and expecting my husband to fill unmet needs from my childhood. This put him in an impossible situation as that was not a role he ever could or should have to fill. I found myself in counseling again after Todd and I had been married for 2 years and our son was born. I was depressed and unhappy and at a point where I could see that if I didn't get myself together somewhat, to some degree, our relationship was doomed. We were fighting constantly and the fights never ended with any resolution. I was emotionally overreactive, blamed him for everything, and threatened divorce weekly. My husband was withdrawn and weary. I started on antidepressants, and along with secular counseling, that was helping me feel somewhat better. I didn't realize it then, but I still had a very long way to go in my recovery journey. It was around this time that I felt led back to church to search for some answers. I was raised and confirmed in the Lutheran Church, and as a family, we attended church on Sundays, and we wrote prayers before bed and before Sunday dinner. Not the rest of the week, but Sundays we always prayed before we ate. And that was really the extent to which God was involved in our home and daily lives when I was growing up. I stopped attending church sometime in high school when my parents stopped making me go. And my guidance for how to live in my 20s came from Cosmo magazine and Oprah Winfrey. And you can see how that turned out. I started meeting one-on-one with a pastor to explore what this faith thing was all about. And I vividly remember the moment when I decided that I was really going to believe that God and Jesus were really real. It was scary to me primarily in how it felt like I was giving up control. I began to get connected at church with Bible study and serving. And my husband, who had been raised as a Catholic, agreed to come to Sunday church just so we could attend together as a family. You can stop right there if you're thinking this is when the story gets all rosy, because it does not. This was truly the very beginning of a journey that God was taking me on. And although I had indeed surrendered my life now to Him at age 31, I was nowhere close to surrendering my will to Him. I was still doing things very much my own way, the way I always had, while learning about God and the Bible and surrounding myself with other believers. As I became more and more involved at church, I became more and more self-righteous. You see, I'd always been concerned with doing things the right way, and now I had the ultimate right way at my fingertips, the Bible. And I was going to thump it on everyone's head that I could find. I understood intellectually the concepts of God's love and grace, but I couldn't apply them in my life as I was still hanging on to my need to control, perform, and look good to feel worthy. Letting go of those things was not even in the realm of possibility for me, for if they disappeared, I felt like I would disappear too. Things had settled down to some extent at home with my newfound faith, but my husband was still feeling resentful at all the time I was spending at church. He felt left out, and I didn't do much to make God appealing to him, as I was guilty of trying to be his own personal Holy Spirit. That's not God's plan, by the way. I was involved at a leadership level at church and found myself spending all my time doing the work of the church and forgetting to spend time in relationship with God. I was performing again, looking for affirmation from human sources. My faith withered from lack of time and attention to its author. I was pretty much spiritually bankrupt when I turned 40. I had stopped fighting with my husband over the last several years, finally realizing that the more we fought, the more our intimacy suffered, and that's what I was fighting for in the first place, was true emotional intimacy. Things were calmer, but my emotional needs, some legitimate and some not, were going unmet, and my husband's silent resentment was growing day by day. The distance between us felt cavernous, and ultimately this led to a huge crisis in our marriage. I was still seeking affirmation from everyone else in the world and could not understand why my own husband could not appreciate what everyone else so obviously could see in me. I wanted to be around people who made me feel better about myself, and he did not. I was not at all interested at this point in what God had to say or what his plan was for me. Frankly, I was a little peeved that I was going to church and working for the Lord, and he didn't seem to be doing anything to make me happy. I recall this as being one of the most distinct times in my life when I heard the enemy whispering things in my ears. Lies like, the kids will be fine if you get divorced again. Children are resilient. The grass is greener on the other side. You deserve better than this. Todd will be happier without you. Believe me when I tell you, the father of all lies is capable of some whoppers. Just as vividly, though, I remember sitting alone in a parking lot as my life and marriage were unraveling and suddenly feeling God's hand literally come down from heaven and pull me out of the mire that I was drowning myself in willingly and saying, "No, daughter, come back to me. I have a better way." Later that night, my husband asked me to pray with him for the first time ever. Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say I said no. I was mad and defiant, but I knew nonetheless that God was there in that situation, and he was going to try bring hope and healing. Todd and I got into marriage counseling, and through this painful time, God answered a years-old prayer, and my husband surrendered his life to the Lord. The journey to restore our marriage was long and arduous, and I would not wish the moments of raw desperation that we both felt during that time on my worst enemy. But by the grace of God alone, we made it through to the other side. I know that we could have never survived this crisis without God. We had left the church where I had been so involved and started attending New Song, which we were once told by someone was a church for hurting people. And that's what we were, and that's what New Song was to us. This would be a good place to end the story. And indeed, I thought for the last several years that I had arrived at the desired destination. Our marriage was better than it had ever been. Our kids were doing well. We were both successful at our jobs, and we were going to church that we liked every Sunday. I had resisted getting too involved at church again, and was looking for ways to incorporate my faith into my secular work life. I thought I had found the perfect answer to this desire when I was hired to work as the director of nursing at an assisted living facility, and my new boss was actually a Christian pastor who was working in the secular world as an administrator. We started on the same day. We had to work very closely together as we prepared to open a brand new facility. I was so excited to be able to connect with someone spiritually at work and actually make decisions based on spiritual principles. In a lot of ways, I thought I had died and gone to heaven because, one, I was in control of a lot of people and a lot of things, and I could make sure they were done the right way. And I had a boss who had the same rule book that I did, and he and I were going to save the world. I was working with people who liked me and respected my work, and that was making me feel worthy. And the affirmation I received from my boss was particularly gratifying because he was a spiritual person. And it almost felt like getting approval from God. Work began to take up an inordinate amount of my time and energy, and there was little left over for much else, including church. I rationalized this as just being a season, and that I didn't have time for church activities. Besides, I thought, I'm doing church work at my job every day. And as my confidence at my job grew, I leaned on God less and less. I continued to use all the principles from the Bible to serve my own purposes. I hung on every word my boss said, and I really started to worship him. I felt powerful and in control, and my feelings of unworthiness seemed like a thing of the past with all the affirmation I was getting. Can you see where this story is headed? I didn't realize it at the time, but I was setting myself up for the next big crisis in my life, the one that God would use to get me to surrender not just my life, but my will to him. They say that pride cometh before the fall, and I was definitely prideful. Although I walked around at that time, I recognize now, with what was a false humility, pretending to be humble, but doing everything my own way, on my own terms, trying to be God. As I approached the end of my third year at this job, I started to experience some feelings of internal discontent, and I couldn't put my finger on why I felt this way. I knew I wasn't as connected to God as I should be, and that maybe that was contributing to this lack of peace I felt. I knew intellectually that praying and drawing closer to God would help me, but I found myself running away from God instead. I simply couldn't deal with the idea of pursuing him. I had that backwards, by the way. And then feeling like I failed if I didn't do things exactly right. I realize now that my view of who God had always been skewed by my experience with my own human parent. As I began to feel more and more out of control on the inside, I started to act more and more controlling on the outside. If things didn't go the way I thought they should at work, I was emotionally reactive and unprofessional. I tried changing my antidepressant and was considering getting into counseling again to try to figure out what was going on. And I talked to my boss about all these things. I had a very poor sense of boundaries with him and everyone else I worked with, primarily because I was getting my affirmation met through relationships with people. I mentioned even to my boss at this time that maybe getting older and losing my looks was making me feel less secure about myself. Ultimately, though, the people that I worked with began to find my behavior intolerable. I had already discussed a plan to work on that with my boss, but ultimately they asked me to take a leave of absence and get counseling. I felt extremely betrayed by everyone involved in this turn of events, but especially by him, who I had so fiercely believed would always do the right thing. And this didn't feel like the right thing. I resigned on the spot, and I was devastated. My defense mechanisms of performance, position, and physical appearance had been suddenly and abrasively stripped away from me. I felt like I was standing naked in the middle of a street, and I was scared and anxious in a way I hadn't been for a long time. I went from feeling this big to feeling this big. Every bit of pride, spiritual and otherwise, had been smashed to smithereens. As I began to realize that everything I had relied on in my entire life could not be relied on, God was there, letting me know that he would never leave me or forsake me. I was a physical and emotional wreck, but at this rock bottom, God met me. He started speaking his truth into my life and deconstructing the lies that had framed my entire reality for so long. The belief that I believed to the core of my being that if I looked good enough or was smart enough or did things the right way, that I would be lovable. That was a lie. Indeed, my entire life up until 2 years ago, I had lived as one giant walking defense mechanism. I had to learn to let go of old security blankets so I could begin to discover who I was as the daughter of the one true King. I had to stop finding my identity in my struggle so I could start finding my identity in Christ. I had spent years trying to earn love and acceptance from everyone, including God. I needed to surrender all that I believed to be true and trade it in for the truth in the person of Jesus. I had surrendered my life to him 17 years before, but he was now calling me to surrender everything else to him, most importantly, my will. I had to let go of my need to be in control and trust that his way is a better way. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. This was one of the first verses that God led me to in those initial days and weeks after everything else was stripped away. I had spent so much time relying so much on my own understanding. If I could understand it, I could control it. I needed a new approach. My recovery journey jump-started when I finally submitted my life and my will to Christ's care and control. It has been a long road, and it has involved intense grieving for what I missed out on as a child, and painful revelations about how my own behavior over the years was destructive both to myself and to others. I was blessed to have a very supportive husband, a wonderful Christian counselor, my church family, and Celebrate Recovery to help me through this process. God has showed up in my life so readily and so consistently since I invited him in on his terms. Daily, he reveals himself to me. He leads me, he encourages me, and he gives me peace. And I know now there's no destination to arrive at, only the journey, and that daily submitting my will to his has to be part of it. God is in control, so I don't have to be. He loves me, his daughter, exactly the way that I am. I am complete not because of who I am, but because of what he did on the cross. He loves you too. Thank you for letting me share.